Hello, everyone. Welcome to MD Media Show. Here, this panel. This panel is a weekly episode, a weekly show that covers what's happening in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa in general. Today, we'll be continuing with what we started last week, auditing the 2018 Promise of Reform, Peace and Security Lens. So we'll be looking at the same subject with the panelists, but through the peace and security lens. And before we do that, I just want to play this clip, and this is from what's happening in Oromia.
Ciceroom barattoonni yuunivarsiitii Dirree Dhawaas halkan edaa hiriira bahuun dallansuu isaanii dhageessaniiti jirum. Ajjechaan uummata Oromoo irratti raawwatamu saffisaan akka dhaabbatu uummanni Oromoo aggaammii akka sabaatti itti dhufe tokkummaan kee akka qolatu hiriirtonni waamicha dhiyeessaniiti jirum.
There is a lot of protests happening, and many are watching closely as this develops because of what's happening specifically in Wallaga, East Wallaga, North Shore, East Shore, and Orogudru, still in Wallaga area in Oromia region. Today I'm joined by Professor Scale, Duke, Burbridge, and a new panelist, Isaias Ailamariam. Welcome, Isaias. It's great pleasure to have you here. You are muted. So today we will have this subject, but as usual, we'll start with what stood out, what the highlight of the week is for each panelist. We'll start with Professor Scale. Scale, what stood out for you over the past 7 days? We met last Friday on this show. What is the highlight?
I guess what stood out for me today is the utter inhumanity that was perpetrated against the Oromo individuals in Jardega district of Orogudru Wallaga zone. I hope that many of you have seen the images that were coming out of that area. In the last 4 years, murder, crime of extermination, displacement, deprivation of physical liberty, they were commonplace in the entire 4 regions in what is used to be known as Wallaga, in East Wallaga, West Wallaga, Kellam Wallaga, and Orogudru. Under Abiy's regime, we have witnessed gruesome scenes of maimed and tortured bodies, mutilated by beasts, and this is not in Wallaga, but in all over Oromia, particularly in the east. The homesteads of individuals, farmers deliberately set on fire and burned to the ground. We've seen in the last 4 years that Oromia was generally drenched by blood, but nothing was known about it. It was the hidden war. I think we talked about this last week, that it was a hidden war. If because of the Ukrainian war, the Tigray war, which was the deadliest and the largest war in the world until the outbreak of the Ukraine war, it was a forgotten war. But the war in Oromia is the hidden war. So under Mr. Abiy, Oromia has endured inhumane acts of similar character of what happened in Tigray that the world knows about. It's torture, intentionally causing great suffering, serious injury to the body and to the mental and physical health of the targets, the victims. We have heard horror stories of torture in prisons. If you talk to some of the people who were in prison for a considerable period of time and they came out of there, the acts of torture that the government had perfected, the inhumanity, the barbarity is just unbelievable. But what I saw in Jardega, the images that I saw in Jardega, it simply seared my conscience. This is not even what I expected. I guess historically, we have heard about all kinds of cruelty, inhumanity, but I am amazed that humans still have the capacity, that human beings still have the capacity in the modern world, in this world, to smother their conscience and to act like beasts. The depravity, the callousness with which the so-called Fano from Amhara region perpetrated severe acts of atrocious crimes in Jardega was taken to new heights. We've seen the decapitated heads of young Oromo individuals on pikes that were paraded around in the Amhara region. The heads were taken to the Amhara region. People parading it and then celebrating the conquest. They were put on display, and what is surprising to me that the heads, the decapitated heads of these two individuals, were put on display while the perpetrators also give press briefings about their exploits. Now, as horrifying as that image is, as terrible as it is, I was personally really tortured by the sight of the act of flaying or skinning people alive, skinning a person alive. I thought the notion of skinning people alive, it probably occurred in history. I was aware that flaying occurred in ancient and medieval periods in Africa, in Asia, and in some parts of Europe as a punishment, as torture. The act of removing the description, skinning people alive, I thought that was just a way of describing some level of inhumanity unknown to man. That's what I thought. That was simply a way of describing cruelty. But skinning a person while they're alive, I thought that had gone, that had belonged to history, but we saw it in Jardega. We saw it, a human person, a human being, skinned alive. So that kind of the method of torture, the slow killing of person, is now alive and well in Ethiopia. I never expected that kind of cruelty would exist, but I saw it this week. And now, while this is happening to Oromos and in Oromia, the government in Arat Kilo did not say a word about it. That level of inhumanity occurs in a Hobbesian state of nature where an overarching authority had failed. Where there is a government, you would not expect that kind of cruelty. But that government that is entrusted with the mission or the responsibility of protecting citizens did not even report it. And today I'm hearing that that region or Lega region is actually going to be put under a separate administration. After all of this, I don't know what's going to happen in Oromia. After what we have seen, after 4 years of command post rule, periodic campaigns to exterminate the insurgents, utter cruelty that occurred in the darkness, and what we have seen this week that stood out for me, I am not sure what they're planning to do in that part of Oromia. That said, I just wanted to say that cruelty is a means that delights and binds most of the ardent supporters of supremacists. It cements that the bond that exists upon people who want to impose their domination on others. That is being perfected in Ethiopia, and the world is simply standing aside and condoning it. Really, that's what stood out for me.
I don't even have words, to express how tough this is. forget, about those who saw it and receiving this, even to hear it. Um, Duke, what stood out for you?
Well, for me, aside from the things that are going on in Oromia, I was looking at the humanitarian progress that's been made in Tigray, and it's been entirely underwhelming. If you look at where we are right now with food distribution in 2022, after about a month of unhindered humanitarian access, it was promised, it hasn't been delivered. You can see that what was happening last year when they started a food distribution round in mid-October last year. They also started a food distribution round in early October this year. If you look at the maps up on the screen, on the left, you see the progress that had been made in the first couple of weeks up until December 1st of 2021. Now, this is after they had blockades. There was no fuel after October 18th was when the fuel ran out for the humanitarian distribution. They were borrowing fuel. They didn't have much food. They were still able to get food up to people in the Northwest zone to a small extent. Now, this was that food distribution round that lasted for 10 months. It's supposed to last for 6 weeks. It lasted for 10 full months. And they were still at a better pace in the Northwest zone than we are today in the current food distribution round after almost a month of what has been promised was unhindered humanitarian access. Now, if you look at the logistics reports that are coming out, they're now being published in joint with the Ethiopian government. The UN OCHA is now publishing data unconfirmed from the Ethiopian government. This is a reckless practice. It's a horrible practice. And if any report that is published with the Ethiopian government says that food is just getting in, traffic is moving nonstop to bring food in. Any report that relies on their data says that that food is coming in nonstop. However, this food is not being distributed, at least, and it may not exist because the UN is, by collecting data, by using the government to collect data about food distribution in Ethiopia, in Tigray, only months after an independent UN-mandated investigation found that the Ethiopian government was weaponizing humanitarian aid and starvation to subjugate the people of Tigray, is a horrible practice, and it speaks to what the UN sees as the value of civilian life in Tigray, which sadly isn't much, and it's a real problem. So right now, where they've promised unhindered humanitarian access, we don't even have unhindered access to humanitarian data. Nonetheless, the people in Tigray having access to food. This needs to scale up immediately. People are dying right now. People are starving right now. The Northwest zone and the Central zone were the front lines of the famine, as well as the Eastern zone in the north towards the border with Eritrea. And these places need food immediately, and they don't need promises. They don't need these phantom deliveries by the Ethiopian government. It needs to be confirmed. They need to deliver food. If it's unhindered, they need to remove every hindrance whatsoever to allow food to get up there. So what stood out for me last week was the lack of progress. We should be seeing a windfall of humanitarian assistance, but right now it's just on paper. And what's on paper is not particularly trustworthy. And I am sorry for the Tigrayan Americans who have to watch as the US government does nothing, while the humanitarian response in Tigray appears to be taken over by the Ethiopian government, the same Ethiopian government that's starving 5.4 million people who are in need in Tigray for the past 2 years.
Thank you for that update, Duke. It's very valuable information. Isaias Hailomariam is our third analyst today. Isaias Alamariam, a lawyer from the West Coast. It's great to have you as part of the panel today. So, what stood out for you over the past week? What is the highlight for you, Isaias?
Thank you very much, Professor Getachew. Thank you for having me, and Professor Hizgail and Duke. A pleasure to be a part of this conversation. Thank you all. So, what stood out for me in the past 7 days? I was not part of this conversation, but I can tell you that I second with Professor Hizgail regarding the gruesome and the cruel incidents in Oromia. I feel like I didn't know Ethiopia. I was born and raised in Ethiopia, but honestly, when I heard and saw people skinning people alive, I felt like I didn't know Ethiopia. Honestly, this is totally it's unacceptable. It's very horrible and very degrading. I feel ashamed to associate myself with what you call Ethiopia. Honestly, when I saw that, this is just ridiculous, and unfortunately, there are millions of people behind it. There's a political base that appreciates that. They support this process, this cruelty, financially and emotionally. So this is very concerning to me, and I think this is a clear indication of Ethiopia's fragility. Ethiopia is very fragile, obviously, and I think that fragility is more vivid than ever. In Oromia, there's been war almost for the past 2 years, even though the situation in Tigray is very it's been covered. I think it was very apparent, but in Oromia there's been war, hidden war. It's not been covered by the international media, but I think this clearly shows that Ethiopia is obviously a failed state, and based on the indicators that I'll be discussing a little while, and the most part of Oromia is not governable. Obviously, Tigray is almost sovereign. So that shows that the nation state Ethiopia is almost failed. And I think one thing that stood out for me is that the alliance between the Prosperity Party in Oromia and Amhara is just a strategic alliance. They don't have anything in common. They don't have any substance at all, because these groups they kill each other. There's a fight. There's no peace at all, like for the past 2+ years. But they pretend as if Ethiopia is a peaceful country, we're united country, one Ethiopia, etc. So that's one of the things that stood out for me, is that Ethiopia is not united. This is deeply divided nation along ethnic lines, and I think the other thing is the so-called peace deal that was signed between TPLF and the Ethiopian central government, quote unquote, was not honored because people are still dying. There's starvation, there's siege, and there's no public service. I lost my first cousin 3 days ago. He was killed. He was killed in front of his children and wife in Tigray. So obviously, the so-called peace deal is just fake. It doesn't. There's no significant progress in terms of peace. And I think the Abiy Ahmed is using the peace dividend to wage proxy war through Eritrea, because Eritreans are still there. So even though Abiy is not firing bullet, Eritreans are doing that for him. He's using Eritrea as a proxy war. So, and honestly, I'm not sure why our leaders are not aware of this. But Eritrea is still there, and I'm also concerned that the international community is not concerned at all, because they had the two parties signed an agreement. They're not enforcing it. There's no monitoring mechanism. They're not taking action at all. They had people, the two groups signed the agreement, but there's no progress towards real peace. And the other thing is, I think there is misconception now. It looks like there's misconception even among Tigrayan leaders. There's a misconception about peace. They think. I've read a lot of peace briefings from Tigrayan leadership that there's no war in most part of Tigray, where it's just getting better. So after all, most people in Tigray have been killed through starvation and lack of medicine than the bullet, actually. I don't have the clear data, but I think most people died because of starvation. So which means there's silent war, actually, without bullets. So Abiy, he knew that he could kill more people without bullets. So I don't even understand why the leaders in Tigray are not aware of that. So the peace deal is just nothing. It didn't bring anything at all. And the other thing is the international community is also, I think, a little bit misinformed. I think there's misconception about the united Ethiopia. They think if Ethiopia is united in whatever way, peace can be achieved. But I think that's not accurate. I think they don't know, or they don't want to know how to unite Ethiopia. I mean, how to achieve real peace. To be honest, because before disarmament or before any kind of agreement, I think there has to be a political dialogue first. There's no political dialogue. Simply, they told disarm such and such group, and then they think peace can be achieved, and that's not accurate. I mean, there has to be political dialogue first, I think. So, and I think the other thing is that this peace process, the so-called peace process, should have included Oromia. Oromos are almost half of Ethiopia. So, if you don't include the Oromia in this process, you can't resolve Ethiopia's problems. The reason why the EPRDF, the previous regime EPRDF failed is because after the demise of the military regime, the communist, the Derg regime, the OLF was not included in the process. EPRDF left OLF, and then that's one of the mess. You have to include. There has to be inclusive political dialogue, and this current regime also repeated the same process. I think that's the other problem that concerns me. Well, I think these are the main the points that stood out, and I think maybe in the main part of the discussion I will add more. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Isaias, for that. So we'll go to the topic, auditing the 2018 Promise of Reform, Peace and Security Lens. Professor Özgel, I want to play the Prime Minister speaking in Hawassa this week. He's talking about where Ethiopia is, as usual, and where Ethiopia is heading. Let's listen what he has to say.
በሰሜን ኢትዮጵያ የጀመርነው ሰላም ዘላቂ አስተማማኝ እንዲሆን በኢትዮጵያ መንግስት በኩል የሚጠበቅብን ሁሉ ለማድረግ ከፍተኛ ጥረት እያደረግን ስለሆነ ሰላም ለሰሜን፣ ሰላም ለምዕራብ፣ ሰላም ለምስራቅ፣ ሰላም ለደቡብ፣ ሰላም ለኢትዮጵያ፣ ሰላም ለአፍሪካ እንዲሆን በጋራ በትብብርና በፍቅር እንድንቆም በታላቅ ትህትና አደራ ልላችሁ እፈልጋለሁ።
For our viewers, the Prime Minister is saying what has started in northern Ethiopia. The government is doing and will do everything to make it lasting. And he's saying peace in the north, in the south, in the east, in the west, in Ethiopia, and in Africa. So he's, as usual, talking about peace when maybe, I don't know, Professor Özgel, you can correct me, but he's not even 200 kilometers away from an active killing war, on civilians, on what you are mentioning in terms of skinning alive and burning dead bodies and so on. So let's talk about what is the scorecard in your view over the past 4 years, and where we came from, where we headed, and where we are now in terms of peace and security, with a specific focus in Oromia.
Now, what can I say about what he just said? It's very difficult to pin down what he says, because the man doesn't know that he's speaking to a wider public, not to people in the stadium in Hawassa, people who can remember what he said a couple of weeks ago, yesterday. But he is not self-aware. He's just not self-aware. And on this program, I've always said that a pathological liar doesn't know that he's lying. So there's nothing to say about what he's saying, but it's these kinds of not being self-aware, not knowing what is involved in being a prime minister that has gotten out into the conflict and the abysmal situation in the country is just not aware that a prime minister is just a first among equals. That what I mean by that is a prime minister is in a parliamentary system is simply entrusted from among the parliamentary members of parliament to lead the government as long as there is confidence of parliamentarians on him. But what happened is that, like I mentioned the other day, that when he was elected a prime minister, he was elected to complete the term of Haile Mariam Desalegn, but respond better to the demands of the people for democracy. So when he was elected, we thought that we had began democratization, that in Ethiopia, at long last, the demand that had now, at that time, had lasted about 50 years for equality, for liberty, for participation in government, would probably receive some adequate answer. That at least we will begin on the path of some sort of participatory democracy. No one asked for a new ideology that would replace multinational democracy. No one asked for Medemer or his unity. No one asked for the undoing of the political party that had actually led Ethiopia for the previous 27 years, despite the lack of respect for human rights. There was security in the country. The government was competent in securing the borders of the country and also lead the country in the direction of economic growth. There were palpable, visible signs of economic growth for the first time in that country. But he made the choice, and this is about peace and security, peace and security in the country. He made a choice to simply, without any consensus, without any mandate, to reverse the constitution, to reverse the gains that Ethiopia's nations and nationalities had made, to reverse the multinational federation and replace it with them. He simply did not have that mandate. Because he did not have that mandate, and because it was known that the Ethiopian nations and nationalities, except probably one region in Ethiopia, were in favor of the constitutional rights that were granted to them but were not enjoyed, and they were for self-rule and shared rule at the center. That's what he started to dismantle. He was implored to assemble all the politicians or the concerned political stakeholders at the time to produce a roadmap that would lead to a fair, free, and competitive elections. He refused. And instead of a program that would guide Ethiopia taking the first steps toward a democratic or a participatory dispensation, he adopted a program of retrograde. Now we know the program or the roadmap that was given to him was by Izema, or the Ethiopian the Party for Justice, and whatever the name, I don't remember, but Izema, everybody knows it, was given to him by Izema. And now we know that that program was actually crafted in Asmara with the advice and consent of Isaias Afwerki. That was the program that had been unfolding in Ethiopia. The program to go backwards to 50 years. And of course, the nations and nationalities in Tigray, in Sidama, in Oromia did not ask for going back to the era of the imperial period, where everybody's identity was denied, but was rolled into and flattened into one identity in the country. They didn't ask for that. There was no demand for that. This is simply a prime minister who did not understand his mission, who did not understand what a prime minister is supposed to do. A prime minister was not elected on his own right with the popular vote, but simply the party replaced him, took the country in a direction the nations and the nationalities of Ethiopia did not want, did not adopt the roadmap that actually prioritized reforms in electoral competition. There was no other mechanism that existed outside free, fair, and competitive election to complete a transition from an authoritarian rule to democratic rule. But they subverted it. They subverted that. There should have been a program of reforming the role of the courts in the country. That did not happen. That Ethiopia needed a transition that in which the courts are free, independent from the ruling party, but that did not happen. Ethiopia also needed a program of reform in the security sector reform. And that was not supposed to be understood as simply replacing commanders and reducing the number of commands in Ethiopia from six to 4. It was meant that there will be a firm civilian control over the military. But she even militarized the society and militarized politics in the country. Because of all of this, and of course, no economic program whatsoever that was necessary to address the grievances that the protesters of the period from 2016 to 2018 had. So in general, instead of going forward according to fulfill the demands of the Ethiopian people, the entire Ethiopian people, he and his intermediaries between the Arat Kilo government and Asmara government concocted this policy of retrograde, a program of going back. And that is what led to the breakdown of the social contract, the political settlement of 1991, the conflict everywhere. This is how we got here. This is what led to the failure of managing the transition, is what endangered the country internally, engulfed by civil war internally and surrounded by enemies. I'll come back to that later on, but surrounded by enemies. Made Ethiopia an international pariah. And it's the mismanagement of the transition that had gotten us into this way. And this man alone is responsible for that, with his intermediaries, with Isaias. Now Isaias is in charge. Eritreanizing Ethiopia instead of the hoped for Ethiopianization of Eritrea. What we have is Ethiopia is Eritreanized, and Lord knows whether we're going to have constitutional rule or we're going to be just like Isaias. That's where we are right now.
Thank you, Professor Scale. I just want to share with our viewers some figures. This may not be a comprehensive one, but this is since Abiy Ahmed came to office, we see here the accurate data showing a dashboard for Ethiopia. So from April 2nd, 2018, that is the day Abiy took office, we have seen, excluding the Tigray war, 2,910 battles, violence against civilians, explosion, all that, and with fatalities of 16,495. And this is for the whole country, excluding Tigray. And if you zoom in into, this is a fatality, how the graph, you could see that how everything started to skyrocket starting 2020. And if you look at Oromia region, this is the number of counts. And one thing that you see on the left side, on the right top side, is a 246% increase over the past 2-3 weeks relative to what was average there. So there is a 246 increase, and only in Oromia, 7,667 fatalities there. And we are not, claiming this is an exhaustive list. And if you look at Amhara region, in 2021, there was a peak there, this number of events, and compared to what was on average the past 2-3 weeks, this is 100% decrease we are seeing. Everything excluded Tigray, but if you look at Tigray based on the figures we heard, 600,000 people died, and if you count it's 730 days that this covers, we are talking about 822 people per day. And if you include the Amhara and Afar region, which would amount into 1 million, we are talking about 1,370 people per day killed during the past 2 years. Just sharing with this, Duke, you were in Ethiopia and you advocate for peace. And the time you were there, I think we covered it last week as well, but can you speak to how you saw Ethiopia evolving or devolving in terms of what we can say about peace and security in the Oromia region, what we are seeing, and in general in the country?
Yeah. When I was there back in 2019 and in the early part of 2020, before I had to leave because of COVID, that's when the situation in Oromia was getting very bad. There were, up until then, there had been a lot of hopes, and there still were, I think, in the international communities, a lot of hopes for Abiy to become this new breath of fresh air. That obviously didn't happen. What was happening in Oromia at the time, when you saw that there were beginning to be challenges to Abiy's, this sort of unspoken writ of authority that he had, this exaggerated role that he saw for himself as a prime minister. When you saw challenges to that from Oromia and you saw challenges to that from Tigray, it was a very familiar scene. It's interesting because I was there interviewing primarily Ethiopian Muslims, and we were talking about something that had happened back in 2011, 2012 with they brought in this sort of political religious cult, and then if you didn't join it, if you were a Muslim, you were considered a terrorist. Then all of a sudden, flash forward almost 10 years later, every opponent to Abiy was considered a terrorist. I remember when they wrote the law that they finally got Jawar on and shut down the political system, the local political system in Oromia that was challenging Abiy. In Tigray, they everything that happened there, we've gone over it, pretty extensively. But those should have been such early warnings that this great opening that everybody was talking about with Ethiopia was maybe not going to play out the way they thought, because this had been seen in several different countries when you have this big opening, and it had been seen, it seemed like, in Ethiopia before, although I'm not quite, there are people on this panel that know a lot more about Ethiopian history than I do, that's for sure. But this regression back to, he had these promises, we're not going to put everybody in jail because we fill up the jail, but he evidently had enough room for everybody that he could find in Oromia at the time, throwing people in jail. As for us, it was saying, torturing, forced disappearance, it just based on nothing, based on, we heard that your brother is in the OLA, so you and your whole family are coming, and now we're going to burn down your house. And this was the type of thing that was happening in Oromia. And it was looked at as, Oromia was almost a spoiler to this great Ethiopian unity that we were going to see, which back at that time, the USAID was holding events, was promoting events about the Ethiopianness, this unified Ethiopia. I forget the name they gave to it, but it was this was something that was being promoted by the Ethiopian government and by the international community, and anybody who stood in their way became a spoiler rather than a legitimate grievance, rather than a people with legitimate grievances, rather than an indication that maybe things weren't going to go as planned. They became people who wanted to ruin this fantastic future that Ethiopia saw for itself, or that the international community saw for Ethiopia. And I think that's where things fell apart as far as the international response to what was happening inside of Ethiopia. When I came back to the United States during COVID, I watched in horror as the situation in Oromia didn't necessarily go away, but it died down a little bit as the situation in Tigray became more prominent, and you just saw that this is the way Abiy was going to run the country. This is the way Ethiopia was to be governed. Was that he had this impression of a great negotiator, or a compromiser even. But if you oppose him, if you get on the other side of him, if you refuse to accept the deal that he's offering to you, then he will come down on you with hellfire, with all of the fury in his arsenal, which is considerably more than we thought was possible. Forced starvation, killing innocent people, burning people alive, these sorts of things that I don't think people saw coming, particularly in the international community. And we refused to see it. We refused to look at it because this was our guy. This was somebody that we were supporting. Prime Minister was going to be a breath of fresh air. We were willing to, assign all of the victories that happened as far as the reforms or economic reforms. We were willing to pretend that this was them, that Abiy somehow built the dam himself and everything, but we ignored some very, very clear signs that things weren't going well. And I don't know to what extent that was ignored in Ethiopia, because by the time I had gotten there, every time I said something about Abiy, people were like, don't mention that guy. It was the sort of novelty had worn off inside Ethiopia. Abiy mania had really burnt itself out at that point, and people were becoming quite critical. But that was not catching on with the international community. This was still somebody that they wanted to support, regardless of what happened. So, yeah, I mean, that's Ethiopia. It seemed like it fell into this pit, and it hasn't gotten out of there yet.
Thank you, Doc, for that. Yeah, I think, yes, we know he's a killer, but he's our killer kind of approach. Isaias, I want to come to you. You started mentioning about the fragile nature of Ethiopia because of what has been happening in different regions in Tigray, Oromia, and elsewhere. I think one of the things that people are now at the state of numbness in terms of hearing a number of outrages, types of killing, medieval period, tools and so on used. So what is your take in terms of what has happened? You were mentioning about what brought Abiy power and then what happened after that. Can you speak to that?
Sure. I think, before that, maybe like if you allow me, I want to say a little bit about in general, like peace. So, I mean, in general, peace is a very dangerous concept for dictators. So in time of peace, people ask a lot of things like, development, service and living conditions, employment, etc. So, the dictators have to keep people busy in war. So that's a trait. It's a common trait among dictators. So Abiy is doing the same thing. He's a narcissist. Basically, he keeps the country busy, or people kill each other, so they don't have time to ask questions. So that's what he's doing. But I think before I dive into the fragile states index, I think there are two major factors behind the political turmoil and the volatile security condition in Ethiopia. I think I'll put them in two. The first one is the location of Ethiopia itself, like being located in East Africa, one of the most politically volatile and insecure places in Africa. I think that's one of the factors, but there are exceptions, of course. Kenya is also in East Africa, but Kenya has a relative peace, and there are reasons for that. So I think one of the reasons is the location of Ethiopia. Ethiopia being in East Africa itself is it makes the country prone to different political and security concerns, I think. And being Ethiopia being adjacent to the Red Sea corridor is also another factor, because the Red Sea is the major trade route. Obviously, there's radical terrorism and different issues down the road. And the second and the most important factor is the political culture in Ethiopia for generations. So that's the main problem. It's marked by ethnic conflict, rivalry, competition, and hate, prejudice, you name it. So that's the main reason why we're here. Abiy, his ascent to power isn't an accident, obviously. That after the previous prime minister Meles failed, I think his days created a vacuum. I think regardless of his he has a lot of limitations, obviously, a lot of issues, but I think he was strong enough to maintain Ethiopia by hook or by crook, anyways. So during his presidency or his reign, Ethiopia has a relative peace compared to what's going on right now. So I think Abiy's coming to power was an accident, obviously, but I think he took that opportunity to rewrite history in his own way, and that created a lot of mess. So that being said, you mentioned about the fragile state index. I was looking at this index, the 12 indicators, and it's just interesting. Like almost all of them fit into Ethiopia, the current Ethiopia. Actually, the first one is the security apparatus. Most of Ethiopia is ungovernable, basically. Almost most part of Oromia, Tigray is completely sovereign, to be honest. And the second factor is factionalized elites. So obviously, I think this requirement also, there are radical elites openly calling for genocide in every social media from different countries of the world. So obviously, that requirement also is present in Ethiopia, in current Ethiopia. And there's group grievance, obviously. Since Abiy came to power, there are additional two states. Two states were created already. Ethiopia had 9 states prior to Abiy. Now I think there are additional 2 more states, which means people have more political question. So there's dissatisfaction, and there's actually people are going towards more federalism, actually, like more autonomous. They're not being united, actually. So Abiy wants unified Ethiopia, which they call Andit Ethiopia, but Ethiopia is actually going towards more like autonomous. People are being, more autonomous and claiming self-rule. So that shows that Ethiopia is not going the way Abiy wants. Actually, the Gurage and other people are also asking. They're demanding to be state separate. So it's just interesting. And economic decline and poverty is I think the fourth requirement or indicator of the fragile state index. Obviously, their inflation is more than 24%, I guess, and the dollar exchange it rose from $27 in April of 2018 when Abiy came to power. Currently, the dollar exchange is $52 in just a short period of time. So that's also an indication that Ethiopia is failing and economically struggling. And the fifth, uneven economic development. Obviously, most people in Ethiopia are very poor, under poverty line, actually, very poor, but very few have money, obviously, through corruption in different ways. So that's very clear. And human flights and brain drain, obviously, the floodgate of migration opened already ever since the war started. Thousands and thousands of people are migrating through the Red Sea to Europe, the United States, a different part of the world, even America. Declared Ethiopia a TPS status, a temporary protected status. So the Homeland Security declares TPS whenever there is a serious human rights humanitarian crisis in a country. So obviously, thousands of people are migrating, and state legitimacy is another requirement. Obviously, legitimacy of the current regime is highly contested. Professor Scale earlier mentioned about his coming to power, how he came to power. Very fishy. He was not elected, obviously. Abiy it's almost coup. Actually, he was not elected. He rose to power. I think there was a power vacuum when the Hailemariam Desalegn, the previous prime minister, left office. Abiy assumed that gap, so he was not elected. EPRDF was supposed to complete its term, regardless of whether it was elected or not. So that's also very questionable. How he extended the election, postponement of the election, also against the constitution. It's extra constitutional. And public service, there's no public service, obviously, no public service at all in Tigray. And human rights and rule of law, it's interesting. Ethiopia is 122 out of 139 countries in the world. So it's not the bottom. It's in the bottom in terms of rule of law. So, I mean, I can go on and on. Like all the 12 requirements are fulfilled, basically. Like the last one, I think the most relevant, external intervention. And that's very clear. Eritrea is invited by law, like legally invited and embedded Tigray, obviously. And also the Eritreans are participating in Oromia. Actually, they're killing people, civilians in Oromia. So obviously, Ethiopia, to my understanding, is a failed state based on this international standard. So I think the international community has to pay serious attention. If they want real peace and very stable country in East Africa. Otherwise, the international community, including the United States, could experience something unintended consequence. For example, in terms of migration, if Ethiopia fails completely, it opens the floodgate of migration. That's a very serious issue, and international trade through the Red Sea corridor can be affected. And radical terrorism can also flourish, especially in Somalia and around. I think that these are the main points I would like to highlight. I can come back to the other points in a little while. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Isaias, for that. So what we are seeing on the screen right now is the aggregated index, and we're seeing Ethiopia here on the arrow. It's on the alert. So it's if you look at the index in terms of numbers, it's 99.3. So that range is in this alert one. So there is before that a big range of warning before it is stable, and after stable and sustainable. So Ethiopia, based on this for 2022, on this alert side. But still, you have been arguing a lot on this platform how essentially, practically, Ethiopia is a failed state. Maybe I think our viewers can check our previous past episodes on the subject. I want to bring to your attention that how are the people reacting now? We have seen university students, at least over the past 2 years, we haven't seen on this scale protesting, and in different countries as well. There is an ongoing call. We also know teachers, university professors, for a different reason, they are also protesting. But Arakilo, the Prime Minister's office, and the Prime Minister, including his advisors from the church and so on, they are still talking about Ethiopia rising and so on. So what is your take on what's going on now? Will this be something that would change in terms of the push? Also, we saw the one of the main opposition parties in Oromia, the OFC, called today for solving the crisis, the war, the killing in Oromia through peaceful dialogue and so on. So is there any appetite from the Prime Minister in addressing what's happening in Oromia through peaceful dialogue?
No, there isn't. Actually, he is responding to what the Izema party press statement calling for more violence in Oromia, explicitly ruling out any negotiations, and that's what the Prime Minister is actually responding to. The Prosperity Party is meeting in Hawassa today, and in Hawassa they have decided to place Oromia under effective command post rule, military rule. They have effectively dismantled the Oromia police and the Oromia special forces because in recent days they have been trying to protect the people, and many were defecting to the OLA, and now they have decided in Hawassa that the Oromia police and the Oromia special forces are no longer going to function in Oromia, especially in Wallagga. That the ENDF that was in Wallagga, about 8 divisions that was in Wallagga, that was taken to Tigray at the beginning of August, or airlifted or transported there to fight the Tigray war. Whatever remains of the divisions in Tigray, they have now been brought back, and these are the ones that are going to enforce the law. It's the ENDF, the Ethiopian National Defense Force, that is going to operate in Oromia. That means there is no tendency, there is no sign that the Prime Minister will even try to open dialogue with the OLA. He has made that pronouncement on Parliament about 2 weeks ago, in which he said that the OLA is bereft of purpose. The OLA has no command and control structure, so they cannot even talk to them if they wanted to. So that does not exist, and here is the reason why. Because that relates to the number that you showed about casualties or fatalities in Oromia being about 7,000. I think ACLED, they collect data in their own way, but I don't think they were able to collect data in a way that actually reflects the number of deaths that occurred in Oromia. Your percentage tells a story about the 246%, tells a story about the rise of violence in Oromia, but it doesn't include the people that were in prison, the thousands of people that were imprisoned and then hauled out of prison, simply shot. People who were dragged out of prison and simply shot by security forces, left to be eaten away by hyenas and other beasts. This story actually spans the whole of Oromia and the whole 4 years. So that doesn't accurately reflect the number of fatalities in Oromia. The reason that violence, that they resort to violence in Oromia is in 2018, the ODP, when it renamed itself ODP and not the OPDO, the Central Committee sat down in Adama and they decided that Tigray remained in power for 27 years, and one of the things that they did to remain for that long in power in Addis is that they did not tolerate dissent in Tigray. Tigray was their power base, and there was absolutely no tolerance of political differences in Tigray. And the modus operandi here is, or the modus operandi for them in Oromia is to take a page out of TPLF as they understood it at that time, and not allow any political opposition in Oromia. This is the Central Committee of ODP that decided. We know it because we heard it. Some of the members of the OPDO that have since defected told us. We saw the documents on this one. So they agreed to obliterate any opposition in Oromia, because Oromia is supposed to be the power base for the powers that be in Oromia and the powers that be in Arad Kilo. So Oromia is not going to see any dialogue. Oromia is the preserve of the ODP, or the Oromia Prosperity Party. It's the power base, the exclusive power base of Abiy Ahmed, and is not going to tolerate any difference there. The eruption that you saw this week, I want you to pay attention to that. The eruption, it looks like it is a spontaneous response to the excesses of what happened in West Oromia. Now, this actually shows because all of the universities in Oromia, from the west to the east, I don't need to name them, but I could, from Salale to Bule Hora, to the southeast, all of the universities in Oromia have come out to express their outrage, their demands. They've put out their demands. It's uniform. Their slogans are uniform. They came out at the same time in all of these universities. One cannot say this is spontaneous. This is actually a coordinated effort. And now they have set out a program of protest this week in which students even in high schools are going to come out, and today many have tried. They have also closed down the roads leading to Finfinne at Korinchini from the southeast, and they have vowed to do the same in all of those in all directions, the roads that are leading to Addis Ababa. And the point of this fragility, I think that Ethiopia had passed that the fragile state where that designation is used to describe weakness, state weakness, and the lack of legitimacy, and that citizens become vulnerable to shocks in a situation where the state is a fragile state. I think Ethiopia is a failed state for all intents and purposes because failed state is a state where the government is basically unable to function in a proper way, expected to function in a way in the basic forms of providing peace and tranquility. It's not able to do that. It's a failed state, but I don't want to go into all of that. But it is basically a failed state right now, even beyond the fragile state.
Thank you. We'll be broadcasting this on the satellite as well to the Horn of Africa, so we have a limited time. But I just want to hear, Duke and Isaias, what your final thoughts and in terms of how this might play out. Because as Gail mentioned that this has been a hidden war and it didn't get the attention it deserves, both domestically and internationally. But we are hearing from the Oromia MEPs in the parliament. They are pushing for dialogue to happen. They were actually scheduled based on media reports to give a press release, but the government said no, we have to talk. So there is a report of talks behind the scene and the protests that are coming up. So, Duke, how do you see this play out in the coming days and weeks, and what the international community should do? You were alluding to that fact before that, but any hopes in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, they need a national dialogue. Ethiopia needs a national dialogue. It did several years ago. It still does, but you have to be able to speak, to have a national dialogue. You have to be able to challenge the government's narrative. You have to be able to express grievances without being thrown in jail. And we're not there yet, I don't think, in Ethiopia. There needs to be, the confidence building measures, there's a term that's abused a lot, but there needs to be serious confidence building measures. You need to build trust with people that they can have a national dialogue where they're going to actually come and talk, where it's not just going to be, let's see how to redistribute, what's left of the country to see which elites are going to get, are going to do well from that. And that's going to be a big challenge. But what's going on in Oromia today, if they can't protect civilians, civilian security is completely gone. When you looked at the ACLED data, and Professor was right, the ACLED they get most of their data from media reports, and they exclude some media and include others, and they don't have a great handle on the actual conflict occurrences. But that's a very difficult thing to track. But if you look at there's somewhere around 280 examples of violence against civilians in Oromia in 2022. About 180 of those are Amhara militia, Fano, or Ethiopian military, or special police, or many of them working together. That's as reported to ACLED. That's not, in any one of these instances needs an investigation by a third party. But once you play that horrible game of, violence against violence, of an eye for an eye, revenge killings, revenge massacres, once the civilians become a pawn in, this heavy-handed, brutal crackdown that's happening in Oromia, it seems like you're just paving the way for more and more violence. I mean, this is the best predictor of violence that you can find was there violence there before? Sadly, that's the best predictor of violence. And not being able to express yourself democratically, that's another predictor. All of the things that were on that fragility list. And I remember when this fragile state concept, this framework was coming out several years ago, back when I was in peace building. This was such a big deal. But how do each one of those baskets that they have there, what has happened to that under Abiy? And are these anything that they can make a U-turn on and actually have accountability, human rights, civilian security, rule of law? I mean, this is the thing. These have all been rule of law campaigns. When are we going to actually have rule of law that affects the government, that affects the military, that affects the Amhara militias, that affects Fano? When are they going to be subjected to rule of law? That's what needs to happen. If you can't protect civilians in Oromia, you're going to have a huge problem. It's the largest zone in Ethiopia. I mean, the largest region in Ethiopia. If they can't do that, then it's hard to see anything good coming out. It's going to be more war until the government decides that it's time to not have all of this brutal violence, that it's still going to continue. And there's not a good indication yet that the government is willing to disengage from the kind of, they are a modern state, but the warlordism that you see in these conflicts, you saw it in Tigray, and you see it in Oromia, to where the government is pretending to be just another armed group fighting it out, getting civilians killed, and that's what needs to happen. And Oromo civilians need to be protected. Amhara civilians need to be protected. The Amhara minority living in Oromia, is vulnerable, highly vulnerable to these sorts of massacres. They need to be protected just as much as everybody else. Until you see that happening, then it's just going to be a war that keeps going. I don't know how they're going to come out of that.
Duke, thank you for that. Isaias, I just want to share with you to comment on the international community is very quick to celebrate anything. Actually, even just I just want to show this. This is the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom. He was in Ethiopia. Maybe he's still in Ethiopia, where I just want to share it with our audience as well. In terms of his time with Abiy Ahmed, and maybe I'll show it later, where among other things, he says after exactly 1 month after peace came, to be signed, he's in Addis, and he was thanking the Prime Minister for a warm welcome. And what is your reading of how, again, what's happening in Oromia? Abiy must be happy with the peace deal in northern Ethiopia because he can move forces there without doing anything in Tigray, like you were mentioning before. So, how do you see with vis-a-vis the international community, and what's the dynamics there in Oromia and Tigray? How do you see this play out in the coming days?
Oh, thank you, Professor Getachew. Apologize. So, well, I think the first thing is that in Ethiopia, throughout the Tigray war, also in Oromia, there was internet blackout. So when the moment Abiy started the war in Tigray on November 4, like a day or so immediately before the U.S. election, on purpose, because during that period the international community will be distracted about the U.S. election, and he did it on purpose. They waged the war on November 4, so there is a reason. And also in Oromia, there was internet blackout for almost 2 years. So the international community is not aware. There's a hidden war going on in Oromia as well. So, which means if you control internet, you control the narrative. So the dominant narrative about the war and everything is based on what the Ethiopian state media tell about the story. That's their narrative. So that's the main problem. Even the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, one time at some point he said, "Hey, Abiy told me there were no Eritreans in Tigray." He said that. You can see it on YouTube. And then at some point, a journalist confronted him. So he said that, "Sir, will you apologize now?" And he said he dodged the question, that the UN Secretary General. So which means they can deceive anyone, even the UN Secretary General, the big boss. They deceive everyone because they have the internet, they have the media, they block the internet on purpose. So that's the main problem. The misconception, the misinformation, disinformation is based on that. That's the main reason, the internet and the controlling the narrative. And the problem with the West is that how the West tried to resolve the Ethiopian security and peace process is very problematic and flawed. At some point during the Tigray and the TPLF and the Ethiopian regime peace process, they said African solutions to African problems. So the West, the United States and European Union, they left everything to African Union, the failed institution, the spoiled. The African Union is from its genesis. It's not an institution for people. It's for regimes, for dictators. They don't protect people. They're concerned about their members. It's member-based organization. They care about the leaders and the dictators. I mean, when al-Bashir was about to be arrested, all the leaders, the African dictators, they were concerned. They tried to protect him from ICC, International Criminal Court. So, which means these people, they don't care about the people. The Africans suffer. The African Union is a failed institution. I mean, from its genesis, even the past failures. I mean, the genocide in Rwanda happened while they were watching Republic of Congo, the previous Zaire, and in Cameroon, in Sudan. I mean, you name it. In Yemen. I mean, not Yemen, but I mean Libya. Sorry, Libya failed while the African Union was watching. So, which means they failed. They failed a lot. So I don't have any confidence that the African Union can resolve the situation in Ethiopia, in Oromia, and also in Tigray. They don't. They don't have any resource. They don't have the motive, the appetite, and they don't have any political will and desire at all. So I think the one of the biggest problems is that the United States and the European Union, they are the major donors of the African Union. A lot of the money comes from the West, right? They could have exerted a lot of pressure. I mean, it's been more than a month since the Tigrayan forces signed this peace deal, and they're even willing to disarm, right? So, but nothing happened, nothing progressed, and there's no enforcement mechanism. So, which means that the biggest problem, part of the problem, is the West. The United States and the European Union, they brokered the peace, which is good, but ultimately they don't have any part. They're just observers, and they facilitate the process. They don't control it. Even the 10 or the 12 military experts supposed to be deployed in Tigray are Africans from African Union. They have political motive. They're connected with the chairperson, Musa Faki, which the person who was saying that Abiy's war on Tigray was a law enforcement operation. That's the person in charge of this peace process. This person, he lives in a very luxurious life in the capital city, where most millions of Oromos are protesting today. He's just watching it. They don't do anything at all. So I don't have any trust at all whatsoever when it comes to African Union. I mean, by law, the African Union, Article 4, I've been saying this multiple times, Article 4 of the African Union Constitution, or what they call the Constitutive Act, allows the Union to intervene when there is a serious humanitarian crisis in a member nation. When millions of people were displaced and thousands being raped and killed and starvation in Tigray, they did not intervene. So I don't expect them to do so. I mean, it's just very obvious. So I think the problem is the West and also the African Union, obviously. So I think these are the main problems. I think in this peace process, I think the United States and African Union and other international actors have to pay serious attention, and they have to follow the very accepted norms to bring peace in Ethiopia, lasting peace, if they will. But I think otherwise, I think Ethiopia will be completely, not only a failed state, but I think it could be a threat to the region. I mean, so earlier, by the way, when I mentioned about the fragile state index, I was just trying to frame the requirements of the failed state, but I use the fragile because the 12 requirements are based on the fragile the concept. But ultimately, my conclusion is that Ethiopia is a failed state anyway. So just to correct. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Isaias. Scale, any final thoughts before we finish today's show?
This is a big issue that we raised, so I don't know how I can with like in 2 minutes or 3 minutes I could say what. But I think earlier I have alluded to why internally there is war all over, civil war, that after securing his position within the party and becoming prime minister, Mr. Abiy embarked on removing what he considered obstacles to his restorationist policies. He declared war on multinational forces, commencing with the OLA, and then Sidama, and then Konso. Remember all of that, my friends. Remember all of what happened. Sidama, where 169 people were killed simply for demanding statehood. And Konso, remember those images of the Konso? Remember Walaita, who were herded into prison because they demanded self-rule, which the Constitution of Ethiopia grants them. Remember Benishangul Gumuz. Remember the Command, who actually were erased from their region by the Amhara special forces in the federal government. Remember the Agel, whose identity was deracinated because they actually demanded self-rule. These were all subjected to unspeakable violence for demanding to exercise their constitutional right to self-rule. That's the internal situation about when we talk about peace and security. Internally, this is what happened to Ethiopia. It is war all over. It culminated earlier in the total war against Tigray. Total war. The 800 days old siege. And all the heinous aspect of what happened in Tigray we all remember, but that is the situation internally. For the failed state, we also have to talk about how secure Ethiopia is against external aggression. Remember, I think Isaias, you alluded to this earlier, that when the EPRDF was in power, when Medles was in power, in 2002, Ethiopia actually issued a national security strategy and strategy white papers. There was a national security policy that guides foreign policy and how diplomatic posts actually act. The core of that white paper was, well, it had two sections basically. One was that strength at home should be what influences foreign policy, and foreign policy should be the activity should be basically to help strengthen Ethiopia in terms of development, poverty reduction, internal pride, and response to globalization. That a strong country, an economically strong country, only a strong country could respond competently to foreign policy challenges. The second part of that foreign policy paper actually deals with how Ethiopia must start by achieving peace in the neighborhood. So they had foreign policy guides or strategy towards the neighboring countries. Remember the effect of it. The effect of it was like the Nile Basin Initiative, the IGAD, the NEPAD. All of those were designed to isolate Eritrea and to marginalize Egypt. And they succeeded. The EPRDF basically succeeded in doing both. Abiy came to power, and he did not know how to play the big league foreign statecraft. He just did not know, because the first time that he went to Egypt, he made a gaffe saying that, "Wallahi, I don't harm Egypt." Remember his missteps in Sochi by removing the negotiations on the GERD from Africa to the State Department, and his misplaced priorities to go to war with Tigray when there are foreign policy challenges. After all of that, what you will see today is that first, the Egyptian policy has always been about the Nile River in its relations with Ethiopia. And to make sure that nothing happened to the Nile, what Egypt did was to internally destabilize Ethiopia and externally to diplomatically isolate Ethiopia. That had been a strategy for Egypt forever, for always. As far as instability within, Egypt doesn't have to do anything. The Ethiopian state had done everything for them, as far as instability is concerned. As far as isolation of diplomatic isolation is concerned, since Abiy embarked on his adventurous policy internally, Egypt took that opportunity and signed joint military and intelligence sharing and economic agreements with Burundi, with Kenya, with South Sudan, with Tanzania, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda. And then Egypt signed a military defense cooperation, especially with Kenya, actually staging a diplomatic coup d'etat, because Kenya was supposed to be always Ethiopia's ally. And then Egypt forged a partnership with Djibouti. Once Ethiopia and Eritrea started to move together, Al-Sisi took the opportunity, went to Djibouti, was warmly welcomed, and now Djibouti itself is allies with Egypt. Who is isolated now? Ethiopia. Who is Ethiopia's friend? The dictator in Asmara. There is no peace there. When the Tigray war started, he asked the Sudanese governments to close off the escape route of Tigrayans, and he did. Not only that, he took the claim that he had to all of the land that Sudan claimed belonged to them, and Ethiopia could not do a damn thing about it. In the east, Al-Shabaab could get in, out as it wants. Sudan, there is no territorial integrity. And in the north, Eritrea is in control. Internally and externally, this is a completely failed state. I don't think they will be able to do anything. Whatever remains of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, they're going to send them to Oromia, but I don't think Ethiopia is going to escape being a failed state. That is my final thoughts.
Thank you, Skel Gabisa, for that important conclusion. And thank you, Dr. Burbridge and Isaiah Salamaran, for your time. And I hope to see you in yet another episode of the H Panel. Good night from here.
Good night.
You have been following the H Panel, the weekly UMD media show. Today, we covered auditing the 2018 Promise of Reform, Peace and Security Lens. We'll continue with the same series, and next week will be socio-economic lens, and I'll be joined by a couple of economists, and hopefully Isaiah Salamaran will also join us on that. and I will see you next week. Until then, goodbye from here. Good night.